Now, autocracy is on the rise around the world, and our next guest argues it's now happening in the United States. Democratic politician Stacey Abrams speaks with Michelle Martin about what she says is happening right here in America and what can be done to stop it.
Thanks, Bianna. Stacey Abrams, thank you so much for talking with us once again.
Thank you for having me.
So we called you specifically for an essay, pretty strongly worded essay that you just published in Time. It's headlined, "We Can Stop the Rise of American Autocracy." Why now? What is it that triggered this piece now?
Because we are in the midst of an authoritarian regime. We keep talking about it as though it's something that's looming, and it's critical that we understand it's already happening. But if we want to reclaim our country, we have to understand the moment we're in, and we've got to start fighting back immediately.
Who's the we?
The we is the American people. Anyone who actually believes that democracy should be the organizing principle for how we live together in this country. Autocracy, authoritarianism is an alternative. Under the proposed regime of this current administration and its supporters in the Republican Party, we have an authoritarian regime where we've seen an expansion of executive power, a sublimation of competing powers, both Congress and the courts. But we've also seen attacks on the media, attacks on communities. We've seen the kidnappings of people in our country, including citizens, but we're also watching the military occupation of our cities. That's what happens in authoritarian regimes, and that is being led by the Republican Party, spearheaded and helmed by Donald Trump.
The reason I ask who the we is one of the points that you make in your piece is that historically, governments that have taken on an authoritarian cast or have become, true authoritarians are often voted in.
Absolutely.
And it has to be said, the Republicans in Congress were voted in. The president was voted in. We could dispute what the margins are, but that is the truth of it. So does that suggest that there is a critical mass of people who agree with what he's doing and with what the Republicans in Congress are supporting?
Not at all. So one of the features of modern day authoritarianism, we are used to thinking about autocrats rising, dictators rising through coups d'etats and through military overthrows. But the modern version is actually winning elections. Erdogan in Turkey, Modi in India, Putin in Russia. We've forgotten that he was elected to these. They've been elected into these positions, and they maintain elections in those nation states. Bolsonaro, Maduro has elections. Venezuela has elections, but there is no question that it's an authoritarian regime. And it is a naivete that we hold in America that it's only authoritarianism if we didn't vote those people into office. The question isn't what do we vote them for, is what are they doing with the power they have now? And the reason this is so important is that we are not protected from authoritarianism because we have democracy. We ushered in authoritarianism using democracy, and now it is our responsibility to protect democracy from those who would take it from us.
Your argument is, well, you lay out what you call a 10-step process, and you say that we are at about step 9. Well, let me go through the steps. You say you have a free and fair election, but it's the last time. Exceed the limits of their executive power. Numerous executive orders claiming authority that the president doesn't actually hold. They take competing versions of power, Congress and the courts, and make them complicit or neuter them. Go after the media. Obvious. Gut the government, fire the people who know how to do stuff, go after the people who do the good work. You sue law firms and nonprofits. You have to have someone to blame. If they can push that forward, then we're fighting each other instead of fighting for our country. They incentivize private violence. Now, that's what you say we're at step 9. What do you mean by that? They incentivize private violence. And what do you mean by that? And how do you see that?
Well, we saw what happened in Minnesota to Speaker Worthman, but let's broaden it out. One of the ways private violence takes hold as a means of control is that people feel threatened. They feel a constant sense that their rights and their physical bodies are under duress. And what we have seen happen is that we have a private police operating in the United States called ICE. They go around masked. They do not operate under the rules that we understand in terms of due process. They do not have to reveal themselves. They have blatantly opposed actually complying with existing law. And now we have the president of the United States summoning up National Guardsmen. We have had a court in California say, no, you cannot use the threat of emergency or the declaration of a false emergency to justify this occupation. And we are seeing it happen in Washington, D.C. The way private violence takes hold in a tyrannical, authoritarian, autocratic, insert language here, the way it takes hold is because people start to believe they aren't physically safe. And they believe that it is okay to respond to that lack of safety. But you also see people thinking that violence is the way to respond to harm. And that is why we saw the assassination of a state speaker. We have seen political violence rise in this country. We've seen threats of political violence rise. And we can't see these as separate pieces. They are of a piece and they work together. And that goes to your question about step 9. When we were writing this piece, and I'm so proud to be working with Professor Kim Sheppel from Princeton University. But the point of this is these things can happen simultaneously. We are actually watching step 10 unfold as well. When Texas gerrymandered in the middle of the decade to intentionally strip people of color of their voting power and to hand power to a political party, that was step 10. When Georgia purged 471,000 voters with a very clear understanding of what effect it would have on minority voters, that was step 10. We are watching this happen around the country. When you interfere with elections, the end of democracy doesn't mean the end of voting. It means the end of voting actually making a difference. And that is what we're facing right now. So I would actually say we've now hit all of the 10 steps. And the question is, how much more will we see? Because these steps repeat, they amplify, and they can happen simultaneously.
Step 10 is you make sure no one ever votes again. Now you have them captive. Now you've got them scared. Now you've got them poor. And now you have the power. This is a violent country, and there are a lot of guns. A lot of people have access to weapons. And I'm just sort of wondering if, not to quibble with your kind of steps here, but how do you identify that particular facet of American life with what you call this authoritarian takeover, or this authoritarian push?
So part of the responsibility, you asked me at the beginning, who did I mean by we? We as the people, but they, the authoritarians, are the state. And that's the place where we have to put responsibility. Violence is part of human nature. As you pointed out, political violence has always attended any political system. If you're reading the Bible, violence is rife throughout the Bible. The difference is who is wielding violence as a tool for the accrual of power. And that's why it's so important that we understand it and we identify it. Incentivizing private violence is a step in authoritarianism because it's when the state starts to co-opt the people into doing its will. Because when you have us fighting each other, we are not fighting against those who are taking our power from us. I'm not diminishing how harmful it is and how often we see political violence happening. But what I am saying is that when the state suborns that, when the state incentivizes that, when the state mimics the kinds of behaviors that the people then start to believe are necessary to protect themselves, then that's when authoritarianism has to be rooted out and has to be noted as the cause.
It's interesting because speaking of violence, the U.S. attorney, the newly named U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C., who because of, the district's unique sort of legal framework and relationship to the federal government also prosecutes local crimes in D.C., recently issued a ruling that gun crimes, carrying and concealed, et cetera, would not be prosecuted, but that she has brought felony charges against individuals who were protesting. Like there was an individual who threw a sandwich and was charged with a felony. The grand jury declined to indict. In fact, the grand juries in D.C. have repeatedly refused to validate charges in some of these cases. Especially noteworthy, given that this president refused to call in the National Guard for many hours when his supporters were violently attacking the Capitol, but yet his appointed representatives have issued felony charges or tried to charge people with felonies for throwing a sandwich at somebody.
And that's an important distinction. The reason they went after the person throwing the sandwich was because that was someone who expressed dissent. And in an authoritarian regime, you respond to dissent with overwhelming force. A man threw a sandwich and faced a federal grand jury. The weight and heft of the federal government came after a man who, in a moment of panic and anger, threw a sandwich. Authoritarianism amplifies the smallest behaviors of citizenship and turns them into crimes. That's important to understand, because if you can go to jail for a sandwich, then how dare you protest in the streets? How dare you take action against? How dare you sue? It's why they defunded public television. You defund public broadcasting because public broadcasting dared to tell the truth. And instead of just being angry and fighting in the court of public opinion, you strip public broadcasting of its ability to do its job. And so it's critically important that we actually look at these small moments and knit them together. And that's why the 10 steps are so important, because we need people to see not these as individual distinct moments, but as part of a pattern of behavior and a coordinated attempt to undermine the democracy of our country and make authoritarianism seem normal. That is not normal.
Why do you think it is that, there is supposed to be an opposition party in this country? And in fact, the margins in the Congress are very, very narrow. There were a number of moments where people could have stopped some of these initiatives, for example. I'm just curious why you think it is that they're just, if the situation is as dire as you describe, why more people aren't willing to object or say no?
So let's talk about the people in power. The question isn't, are they voting against their self-interest? It's what interest do they hold? If you are Senator Dan Sullivan, who watches his colleague, Senator Lisa Murkowski, go to the floor of the Senate and play a recording of your constituents who were facing a typhoon, a tsunami, and that tsunami warning only came about because of public broadcasting. Lisa Murkowski voted no. Dan Sullivan said, yes, it's true that this will cause them harm, but I'll fix it later. Because his best interest in that moment, his self-interest was power. His self-interest was basically becoming complicit and not offending the authoritarian leader, in this case, Donald Trump. And so we have to stop thinking that self-interest is one thing. If the interest you have is power, then sublimating yourself to this current authoritarian regime feels like not just survival, but it gets you a ticket to the dance. And so we have to understand that those who are elected to represent us will not do so unless we hold them accountable, and not just at the ballot box during midterms, but every single day. But here's the other piece. Holding them accountable does not mean they will be better. There have been protests in authoritarian nations since the moment those autocrats came to power. And that is why the urgency is now. We have not fully fallen. We are in an authoritarian moment, but we are not so far in that we can't find our way out. We have to recognize where we are. We then have to activate ourselves to do something about it. And that's to your point about who's voting for this, who's supporting it. There's a reason that Republicans stopped having town hall meetings, because they didn't want to be held accountable, because they know people aren't happy. And when we see the economy collapse because of rising inflation, rising unemployment, and slowing economic growth, the reason the president of the United States is trying to remove a member of the Federal Board of Reserve governors is because he needs to be able to manufacture an answer to why the economy is not doing as it should. So we have to recognize, we have to activate, and most fundamentally, we have to reclaim our rights as citizens to a country that works for all of us. And ultimately, that's what I want. I'm not here just to harangue the authoritarians. I'm here to call into action those who believe in democracy. And even if you don't think you believe in democracy, if you believe in your right to make your own choices, if you believe in your own freedom and your own power, then we've got to stop those who would take those things from us right now.
What about the Democrats in this moment?
Yeah.
What's their role? And are they fulfilling it?
We are in a moment where we are looking for leaders, but I actually believe what we need is leadership. Leaders anoint individual people to make decisions for us. This is a moment where we all have to own for ourselves the role we can play. I am a very proud Democrat. And what that means is that I'm part of a very large party that has multiple roles and responsibilities. We are the minority party, which means we do not have the normal levers of power. But Democrats have to still show that we can deliver. And that means that when authoritarian behaviors impact our people, we've got to do something about it. When people start going hungry, we've got to be there to provide access to food. When people can't get what they need, we've got to help them find solutions. That doesn't mean we can solve every problem, but we cannot bemoan our fates and hold our head in our hands. We've got to do the work. And so what I would say to Democrats is, no, we may not hold the majority, but we are watching across this country as leadership is being shown. Washington, Oregon, and California have said in response to the decimation of the CDC, we're going to provide public health to our people. But also down in small communities, they're doing community gardens because they know that the USDA food that they relied on is no longer coming. We have to, as Democrats at every level of government, show that we understand the problem, that we see the pain, and that we're willing to do something to mitigate it. We can't solve it until we have power again, but we can use the power we do have. Because before we had power, before we had money, we had each other. And Democrats are best when we are doing the work of the people.
And before we let you go, I'll tell you one thing that people say to me. Maybe they say the same thing to you, which is, I don't pay attention to the news anymore. It's too depressing. So people say that. They say, it's just too depressing. I just have to focus on my house, my family, my garden, whatever. And do people say that? I'm curious if people say that to you. And if they do say that to you, what do you say?
They do. And my point is, do you want to be able to stay in that garden? Or do you want someone who can come along and say that they want your garden for themselves? And there is no one to go, and you can't call the police because they no longer answer to you. You can't call your city council member because they no longer get to make decisions. You can't go to your job because they've decided your job is obsolete, because they've decided that the work you do is no longer valuable to the regime. Our individual freedom is yoked to our national belief in freedom. If we do not have it at a national level, we cannot enjoy it at a local level. And authoritarians want to take what we have, they want to take what we know, but most importantly, they want to take our will to want more. We can fight back.
And how come you aren't discouraged? What keeps you going?
My grandfather, my mother's father, was born 25 years after the end of slavery. Within 2 generations, his granddaughter became the first Black woman in American history to be nominated to be governor of a state. That arc of history tells me that we can hold this country, that even those who were trampled upon did what they could to preserve our nation. It is not that we don't get to be depressed, but we don't get to allow depression to steal our futures from us. They want us to feel broken. They want us to feel beaten. I was raised in a family that has overcome so many odds, but more importantly, they've always believed that despite how little their citizenship was valued, that belonged to them and they were going to use it to its fullest extent. I am here because, and I'm engaged because I want the full measure of my citizenship to be made real.
Stacey Abrams, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the COP30 climate conference is where world leaders try to hammer out solutions to the growing climate crisis. This year, the United States also boycotted that gathering. In Belém, Brazil, the past 2 weeks have seen indigenous protesters marching for better protections of their own territories, and thousands of youth activists across the world calling for fossil fuel phase-outs, with many saying our future is being burnt down. The Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Elizabeth Kolbert has been covering climate for over 20 years, and her new book is a collection of essays. And she's joining Hari Srinivasan to reflect on what she has learned.
Christian, thanks. Elizabeth Kolbert, thanks so much for joining us. Your most recent book, Life on a Little-Known Planet, takes the reader through 20 years of your essays and reporting on this topic. And there's a quote that kind of sums up some of your reporting. Even as we are upending the natural world, we are coming to understand it in ever more intimate detail. What is it about the natural world that kept you going back to find these stories, to talk to these people, to share these experiences?
Well, the book and, the stories in it are sort of, I think of them as sort of a love letter or love letters, collection of love letters to a changing world, a changing planet. And as you mentioned, I have in the process of writing these stories gone to amazing places, to New Zealand, to the Amazon, to the Great Barrier Reef. And I got to see amazing creatures and meet amazing people. So that, what more really could a journalist ask for than that?
All right, let's talk about some of these amazing people and places. David Gruber is one of the first people you start your book out with. How did you find his work in the first place? What led you to the story?
Well, like all journalists are sort of magpies. I read and came upon a reference to the project somewhere. It's called SETI, which is a purposeful allusion to the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, except now we're looking for cetacean intelligence. So the project is looking to try to decipher the language of sperm whales. Sperm whales communicate through these very elaborate series of clicks that they emit from their enormous heads. And David came up with this idea in concert with some very eminent computer scientists. Could we use machine learning and AI to try to decipher this? It's a big project, and it's a really fascinating project. And I got to spend a week out with them listening to whales, and in the process actually saw a sperm whale give birth, which was just an extraordinary experience.
There's an essay where the book gets its title, Life on a Little Known Planet. It's a profile of an entomologist, David Wagner, and he was in the middle of something pretty audacious. He wanted to try to identify all the caterpillars in America. What is the grand value in this job?
Well, I think that one of the messages I hope comes through in the book is something that I've really come to feel strongly and learned from all of the scientists that I've been out in the field with who study different species, is that every species, and a caterpillar is a species of moth or butterfly that has yet to metamorphose into an adult. Every species is an answer to the great question of how to survive on planet Earth. Every species has come up with a different answer to that question. And when you think about it, that is sort of the vast encyclopedia of life. And what David Wagner is out there doing, as you say, is trying to collect and photograph every caterpillar in North America, which is a vast task. And being with him was, just exhausting. We were running around all the time looking for caterpillars, and found some amazing caterpillars, which didn't really reveal their true colors except under magnification, but are just fantastic creatures. And that he really sees it as a race against time. Will these species even be there, 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now? And we were in Texas, and where they're having a big drought. And so that question of whether drought and climate change is going to just wipe out some of these species was very much, uppermost in his mind.
Kind of maybe a refresher, a biology lesson here. What's the ripple effect when we have, what you describe as the insect apocalypse, right? If there are these species that we no longer have, we might just see them as like, oh, it's a pretty butterfly, etc. But it's part of an ecosystem.
Yeah, and with caterpillars, that's a huge, big deal because caterpillars are a huge source of food, of protein for birds. And when they're fledging their young, there are a lot of birds who basically depend on catching many, 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 hundreds of caterpillars to get their brood, to the point where they can fledge and leave the nest. So, everything, including creatures that we find pesty and irritating, is probably a food source for other creatures. And in the case of insects, that couldn't be more true. I mean, birds, insectivorous birds, fish, everything up the food chain from insects depends on them. And so when you're messing around with your insects populations, you are really messing around with something pretty fundamental to our ecosystems.
You've got a section called Big Ideas, and one of them is carbon sequestration, or taking the CO2 out of the air and figuring out how to push it back underground. There are places where this is happening right now. It's an incredibly small scale. Why is it so important?
Well, one of the interesting things about, how we tend to go about life these days, I suppose, and when I say we, I am speaking very broadly about, people, or certainly people in the global north, is that we introduce things into the environment and then we decide, okay, well, that wasn't such a great idea. Plastics, for example, being, exhibit A these days, but certainly carbon dioxide is way, way up there. So we're emitting, billions of tons a year of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that's warming our planet. We kind of all know that at this point. We kind of all experience it. And if you want to keep temperatures, from exceeding 1.5 degrees, which we're basically at already, you really need to start taking big amounts of CO2 out of the air again. And the challenge here, as you say, the technology does exist to do this. The challenge is that it takes energy. And if you're using that energy, to take the CO2 out of the air, then you sort of say to yourself, well, okay, well, let's just not put the CO2 up there to begin with. And that is a big debate that's going on, even as we speak.
As you read these different essays, you find that so much of how human beings approach just life is the framing of things, whether or not this is a problem. How urgent is this problem? What should we do about it? One of the people that you have, the scientist that you spoke with, Klaus Lackner, he kind of argues really that our sort of moral imposition is part of the problem, in that he says such a moral stance makes virtually everyone a sinner and makes hypocrites out of many who are concerned about climate change but still partake in the benefits of modernity. Right? How do you think about that framing?
Meeting Klaus was a really interesting experience. He's one of the pioneers in carbon capture, and his point was really, look, we produce waste. We all produce waste. We all and we treat it as such. We treat it as garbage that needs to be collected. We don't say, well, you can't produce any waste, and we should treat carbon dioxide the same way. And that's a very attractive argument. When I was talking to Klaus, I found it extremely compelling. The question is, or a question is that practical? That gets back to these questions that of energy use. This is just not something that is going to happen magically. Although I will say that, when people go out and talk about planting trees absorb carbon dioxide. So that is sort of a win-win on the carbon capture front. But, I think that one of the lessons of, unfortunately, the last few decades is that these problems which we tend to create at scale, we're really good at scaling things up, are really hard to confront at scale. So carbon capture, I think, probably does have a place on a small to medium scale, but whether it can ever be scaled to the extent that we just treat carbon dioxide as any other, sort of waste product, it's probably very, very, very difficult.
And there's also seems to be a race for, how to win market share of public opinion. I mean, just recently, Bill Gates wrote an essay, and he argued that the financial resources we're talking about with climate change should be shifted to sort of supporting humans. His quote was, although climate change will have serious consequences, particularly for people in the poorest countries, it will not lead to humanity's demise. He says, health and prosperity are the best defense against climate change. What do you think about that?
Well, I guess I have two reactions. First of all, not lead to humanity's demise is a pretty low bar. It will lead to a great deal of suffering. We see that, practically every other week now with some climate-related disaster that costs a lot of people their lives and costs even more people their livelihoods. We just saw that, with Hurricane Melissa. Which was a very, very severe storm, very rapidly intensifying hurricane that hit Jamaica. So I think that, this notion that we could just reassign resources and let climate change continue sort of unabated, and that somehow we're going to make people so prosperous that this isn't going to matter. I find that very hard to believe, unfortunately. But that is kind of an argument that's out there. What we really need is just, more prosperity, not to deal with the actual root cause of the problem. I think it's pretty rare that you can deal with a problem when you don't deal with the root cause of it.
You also profile James Hansen, who we have been alive long enough to remember when he started with his testimony in front of Congress, talking to people over and over again and saying, "Hey, this is a huge problem." You have kind of an excerpt from an essay that you published. This was in 2009. It says you wrote, "Hansen has now concluded that the threat of global warming is far greater than even he had suspected. Carbon dioxide isn't just approaching dangerous levels; it is already there. Unless immediate action is taken, including the shutdown of all the world's coal plants within the next 2 decades, the planet will be committed to change on a scale society won't be able to cope with." We're now almost at the 20-year mark of when that essay was published, when those predictions came true. What is it like revisiting that?
I think, unfortunately, Jim has had an sort of unfortunate habit of being right throughout his career. I mean, he made very, very bold predictions at a time when people were really debating whether you could see the signal of climate change, whether it had emerged from the sort of noise of natural climate variability. And Jim was one of the first people who said it had. And in retrospect, when people go back and look at it, they say, yes, he was right. And he made, just a series of very legible predictions that have all come true. And I think Jim's point there is, it would be very interesting to get Jim in conversation with Bill Gates. You can't, you don't get this planet back. Once you take the climate in a new direction, you don't control it anymore, and you don't get back the climate that you once had. And what is really, I think, crucial to understand is, all of human civilization developed during this time that we now know was a time of relatively rare climate stability. And if you say, we're all dependent, we all live on coasts, we all live in places that have been formed by the climate of the last 10,000 years, and now we're really rapidly changing it. What could go wrong? And now we're seeing, unfortunately, what could go wrong. And I think that reading Jim's really eloquent pleas, almost 20 years later, is kind of heartbreaking, because one of the points I think that Jim would make, and Jim was doing this in the 70s, is we had all the information that we needed back in the 1970s to know that we were facing a big problem, and we didn't act on it.
What do you think has happened in those 20 years? I mean, it became an international priority, right? And there were moments where we saw, hey, we collectively got together to do something about the ozone hole over Australia, and we kind of did it. I mean, in a relatively short period of time. We had the Paris Accords, the planet started to make these commitments, and then you see it just kind of being rolled back. What happened?
I think that, one really simple answer is, look, obviously there are huge vested interests that, are protecting the status quo, which is very heavily fossil fuel dependent. So that's no secret. I don't think at this point anyone would make a secret of that. And we're certainly seeing this administration really trying to cater to fossil fuel interests and, really trying to kneecap other emerging clean technology industries. That, once again, it's hard to argue with that. I think that's just what's going on. So the economics of it are, really, really intense. And there are many nations that are basically, petrostates. And they obviously also have a huge interest in not transforming the global energy economy. So that's, the basis. Now, the question of why, the rest of us, as it were, those of us who are, not petrostates or not heavily invested in the fossil fuel industry, why aren't we all outraged and, taking to the streets to demand this kind of change, is a question that I really can't answer. As you say, it does happen. There are moments when somehow, for whatever reason, public opinion, people get really upset and take to the streets and demand action on climate change. And then we sort of see this lull again. And I think one of the problems is that climate change is a problem that is going to last forever. It's going to be a problem for the rest of, my life and your life, and probably of everyone listening to this tonight. And so it's not something that you can just say it's solved and let's move on. And that's a really hard problem politically to deal with.
Watching this for 20 years now, and considering where the United States was in the climate conversation versus where we are today, what gives the world any, sense that our word matters?
Well, in the climate realm, I think that people only take the U.S., seriously because we are such a big economy, we're such a big energy user, we're such a big energy producer, and we are such a technological powerhouse. And I think the sense is, well, you can't solve this without the U.S. You can only deal with it with the U.S. So basically, we have to deal with the U.S. when they're willing to be in the room. Now the U.S. is not even willing to be in the room. The Trump administration has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. They could still be at this COP in Brazil, but they're not, very pointedly. And some people I think are saying, well, so be it. The world is going to have to move ahead on its own. And one of the big developments in recent years has been China really taking the lead on technologies like, solar panels and electric cars. And a lot of people will say, and I'm not an economist, but a lot of people will say they're going to eat our lunch because we are turning our back. We're going back to, sort of 19th century technologies, and they are moving into, the 22nd century economy. And so that is a question, whether we're not only doing a disservice to the world because we're, simply not willing to be there at the table and acknowledge our role in this huge global problem, this problem that we, to a certain extent, foisted off on people in the developing world who did very little to cause it. But also, are we shooting ourselves, and I hope this isn't too much of a metaphor, in the foot, by turning our back on the economy of the future?
The book is called Life on a Little Known Planet. Elizabeth Kolbert, thank you so much for writing the book and for your time today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Next to Alabama, a state that locks up more of its population than almost any country on earth. That's what inspired. To break that silence, filmmakers Andrew Jarecki and Charlotte Kaufman speak to Hari Srinivasan about how their shocking discoveries inspired a campaign for change.
Christian, thanks. Andrew Jarecki, Charlotte Kaufman, thank you both for joining us. You recently directed a documentary called The Alabama Solution about the conditions inside Alabama's prison system, which houses some 20,000 individuals. Your film has incredible footage from inside inmates who have access to cell phones. But what are the conditions there? Because from the outside, what we see is that the state prisons are operating at nearly 200% of their capacity with just a third of the required staff. So what does that lead to?
The conditions are horrible inside Alabama's prison system, and they're deadly and they're brutal, and they are upheld by a very corrupt administration. These conditions have been documented in a Department of Justice report that came out in 2019, and further documentation followed up in a Department of Justice lawsuit. But it's very hard to understand the everyday brutality and violation of constitutional rights by just reading a report. But once you see it on the cell phone footage, there's a whole new level of understanding it on a visceral human level. And what you see is an environment where your life is threatened every day, where you are not guaranteed medical care, where there's rampant drug use, where people are being forced to work for free, where mental health crises are being exacerbated. And I think what we hope the audience will take from the film is beyond what any written legal document could provide.
Andrew, the cell phone footage, these are from contraband phones, right? But how is it that so many inmates had access to cell phones, and how did you get it?
I was talking to one inmate in the system and asked about how it's possible that there's so many drugs in the system and that there are so many cell phones, which was shocking to us as well. Where are they coming from? And he sort of looked at me incredulously and said, we don't leave, right? And it struck me that it was clear these things were coming in, and we learned about this as we investigated from officers. And officers are operating a very lucrative trade in drugs and cell phones. What's unique is that the cell phones, while they're prohibited allegedly by the administration, they're actually the tear in the fabric of secrecy that we were able to penetrate because of the brave efforts of these men who were inside, who were taking a tremendous risk by sharing their stories and sharing their material.
Okay, they're gone now.
Would a regular phone call be better?
No, because it does not allow us to just be ourselves. When we present our stories, we want to present our whole self, not just our voice.
You highlight a number of individual stories in the documentary, and one of those was a man named Stephen Davis who dies in prison. It's actually through an anonymous phone call that his mother hears that her son was beaten to death.
Okay, well, I understand.
Who's this?
Well, don't, I know you're grieving and mourning, but I want to tell you that your son was beaten to death by an officer. That was a murder. They sweep stuff underneath the rug all the time about this.
Tell our audience a little bit about Stephen Davis and what happened to him.
Well, like a lot of people that are incarcerated, Stephen was a somewhat troubled kid, but not very different than a lot. He went through his life and ran into some problems, especially because of drug use. And so he was in prison under the sort of felony murder statute because he was in a car with somebody who went into a house to buy drugs, and there was an altercation, and that person shot someone and then came back out in the car and forced him to drive away. So he had never pulled the trigger. And, there are many people in prison who do pull the trigger or have pulled the trigger. But he ended up in a jail where he was tased and was essentially was dead for a number of minutes until he was revived. And then after that, had more difficulty, continued to medicate himself with drugs, and ended up in one of the worst prisons in Alabama. There are 14 of those prisons. And it's clear that he got into altercation with an officer. They will say, oh, well, that's because he was threatening the officer. But as we hear from the informant who calls us, he says they make things up all the time like that because they want to be able to say that the inmate was responsible and that they had no alternative but to use deadly force, which was clearly not the case. And we ended up having the ability to hear from a whole series of witnesses who were present at the time and said that was just a made-up story.
We should know that the state of Alabama, in the case of Stephen Davis, says that they maintain that Officer Roderick Gadsden's use of deadly force was warranted because Stephen Davis refused to drop his knives. Has anything happened to that officer since?
This officer was, after the death of Stephen Davis, promoted twice. So he was not disciplined, he was promoted. And then he was put in charge of the CERT team, which is the special response team that's supposed to deal with the most sensitive situations inside the prison.
I was going to say, I think one thing that we observed is that it seems that the administration made a calculation that one of the only ways you can run a facility that is close to 200% overcrowded with 1/3 of the prison staff is by greenlighting brutal tactics. But in fact, I think that brutality creates more chaos within the prison, as our participant, Robert O'Countalis, said. There's the phenomena of hand-me-down oppression. When you have officers constantly treating the population with violence and brutality, that creates a culture of violence throughout all of the facilities, and a culture of tension and trauma and PTSD. So it's really a problem that seeps through the whole system.
It's also worth pointing out that not all prison guards are like Roderick Gadsden, the man who appears to have killed Stephen Davis, along with help from some others. There are guards who are in our film who are extremely understanding, joined the prison system in order to make a difference, to try to do something good, to bring religion inside, to bring care inside to these men. But when the men are dehumanized in this way, when they're brought in and treated in this way, they start to not feel like human beings. And in some ways, the system attracts guards who are willing to and are encouraged to commit this kind of brutality.
You also focus in on how this idea of human rights inside a prison has a long history, going back to the civil rights movement and perhaps even earlier. And a couple of the people that you focus in on, Robert Orr Council, known as Kinetic Justice, and Melvin Ray, who after really years of suffering in solitary confinement and living in these conditions, they sort of band together and create this thing, this idea, this Free Alabama movement. And tell our audience a little bit about what that is and how they were able to orchestrate a statewide sort of work strike.
Robert Earl Council, Melvin Ray, and many other men who we spoke to but who don't appear in the film have understood for over a decade the power of the court of public opinion, and they have understood that if they can reach the public, that the public will be horrified by what's happening inside these facilities in terms of brutality, in terms of free labor, in terms of profiting off of the suffering of others. And they have, really since cell phones first appeared inside these facilities, since around 2013, have been using the devices to capture their realities and share them with the public and with the press in hopes of sparking a conversation about the dire need to change how we deal with justice in this country. And they also have always recognized the power of the importance of the economics in the situation, that this is a system that is profitable. This is a system that provides great value to the state in terms of labor, $450 million a year in terms of unpaid services and labor, and that they have the power to communicate with the outside world. And then they also have the power to, as they say, shut the system down and prevent it from profiting, and hope that that will be a lever to start a real conversation about change.
When you think about the work strike that these men have undertaken, again, it's a peaceful protest, and that's something that's so difficult to achieve in the free world. And yet these men, being restricted by tiny forms of communication, furtively being able to use cell phones to try to organize, were able to just reduce the amount of work that was happening in the prisons. And not just in the prisons, we were really shocked to find that it's not just that Alabama is using the men to sweep the floors inside the prison, which maybe people could say, well, if they're incarcerated, they should do their part. But actually, they're shipped out in vans every morning. They work in lots of state facilities, the governor's mansion, or on road crews. They work at the state fair. But also they're essentially leased to corporations. So a lot of these men who are not deemed safe enough to be released from prison are every day going to work at McDonald's, or going to work at Burger King, or going to work at KFC, or going to work at the Hyundai plant or the Budweiser distributor. They're out in the world, and yet they're not considered safe enough to be given a chance to re-enter society, which is why parole is so low in the state.
The Department of Justice had a multi-year investigation into this, and in the lawsuit that they filed against Alabama, they said the complaint alleges that the conditions at Alabama's prisons for men violate the Constitution because Alabama fails to provide adequate protection from prisoner-on-prisoner violence and prisoner-on-prisoner sexual abuse, fails to provide safe and sanitary conditions, and subjects prisoners to excessive force at the hands of prison staff. Now, for the record, we did reach out to the Alabama Department of Corrections for comment about the conditions that your film highlights. As we speak, we haven't heard back yet, but they did respond to Good Morning America earlier this month. And in that, they said the Alabama Department of Corrections is aware of the film. Production began in 2019 with footage acquired from inmate contraband cell phones. The ADOC cannot confirm or comment on the authenticity of any video footage obtained illegally. What kind of response has the state had? And I guess what's your response to them?
Well, I think the state is responding to our film in a similar way that they've responded to the Department of Justice report, which is to say, we don't agree. We don't have a systemic issue across all our prisons, and we're going to dare defend our rights to run our prisons the way we want. And I think, they can try to say that they can't validate the footage in the film, but we made our film across 6 years. And we did not just collect video footage. We also did extensive reporting through filing FOIAs, autopsies, speaking to multiple government sources, inside sources. And we have not only investigated the deaths you see in the film, but we have also investigated all deaths that have happened within the facilities since 2019, since the release of the Department of Justice report. And our investigation shows that the death rate has doubled during that time, as well as, the drivers, the preventable drivers of death, like drug, murder, suicide, have also increased rapidly. So this is a system that is still out of control, and that the proposed solutions, like building new facilities, are not realizing real results. And in fact, things are getting, have declined further. So it is still as urgent a situation as it was in 2019 when the Department of Justice first came in, as today.
I interviewed Steve Marshall, who's the Attorney General of the state, and asked him if he thought that there were serious problems in the prisons. And he said, well, there's this idea that we have some systemic problem in all of our prisons, and I wholeheartedly disagree with that. I think that that's in part because there's a sort of philosophy that you can act like something's not happening, even if the public is asking questions. But it just also represents the fact that these people are locked away in places that the public is not allowed to see into, right? Journalists are not allowed to go into prisons, except very occasionally in the country, because hypothetically they're like safety considerations. But the reality is these things are happening. There's nothing the state can do to prevent the information from going out other than stopping the cell phones. And in fact, that's what they're trying to do right now. So they're installing jammers and spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to make the information stop flowing, rather than trying to improve the conditions that are obviously generating this kind of information.
I wonder, when you talk about the phones, when you talk about this sort of access to information and transparency, whether this is limited to Alabama, or whether this lack of accountability and insight that we have into prison systems, whether you were able to find this type of a pattern repeating in other states as well.
I would say, the conditions that allowed for the crisis in Alabama to deepen to such a severe extent exist all throughout prisons in America. Secrecy, lack of accountability, a punitive mindset, ability to make people work for free, that exists in all of America's facilities. And I would say, yes, our film is about Alabama, and yes, our film is about prisons, but our film is also about what happens when a government is allowed to detain people under constrained and surveyed communication with little to no accountability. And that's not just happening in terms of our state or federal criminal prison system. That's happening in other arenas too. There is an urgent conversation we need to have about whether detaining people secretly and cutting them off from civil society and cutting the press off from being able to report on what's happening in institutions is compatible with a democracy.
The HBO original documentary, The Alabama Solution, is now available to stream on HBO Max. And I want to thank the filmmakers Andrew Jarecki and Charlotte Kaufman both for joining us and just for making the film. Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching, and thanks for sharing this with your audience.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
As the strength of institutions is tested under the weight of Trump's presidency, our next guest argues that Silicon Valley has already bent its knee in deference, even as changes to the H-1B visa risks jamming big tech's hiring machine. In this month's Wired special issue titled All Hail the Technocracy, Global Editorial Director Katie Drummond paints a picture of how big tech is embracing Trump. She spoke to Hari Srinivasan about what this relationship spells for the future of the industry.
Bianna, thanks. Katie Drummond, thanks so much for joining us. You have a new copy of Wired on newsstands, so to speak, and it's It's called All Hail the Technocracy. You, in an article to sort of introduce this series, you said one of the most visible changes of 2025 and among the most consequential is the tech industry's embrace of President Trump. The industry's elite have fallen in line, demonstrating their allegiance with increasingly grotesque displays of submission. So what the hell happened to Silicon Valley? What are you trying to tell readers in this issue?
Well, we at Wired, have a long history, a 32-year history of covering the tech industry and technology more broadly, and often of championing it and championing innovation in all forms. And so I think for us, for our publication to come out and make this kind of statement should really tell our readers and anyone paying any attention that we see a very serious and very troubling turn in Silicon Valley and in the tech industry. I think you only need to look, at images or videos of, technology CEOs at dinner with the president, sort of going around one by one, offering him compliments, flattering him. You only need to look at, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, in the Oval Office presenting President Trump with a custom-made statue with, a gold base made in Utah. These are the kinds of demonstrations and displays of fealty that we have not seen in this country, certainly in my time working as a journalist. But I think looking back to the first Trump administration in 2016, we saw tech executives very often coming out publicly denouncing the president and his statements against immigrants and so on and so forth, and really sort of coming out swinging in many cases. And what's really notable and what's really important for readers to recognize today is that we are seeing the industry do almost a 180 from that approach, where they are not only sort of working behind the scenes to collaborate with the administration and sort of to find gains for their own corporate interests, but they are doing it overtly in public. This is sort of not even happening behind the scenes. This is happening in plain sight, and it is a very troubling phenomenon.
The central article is authored by Stephen Levy, who's someone that has covered Silicon Valley for quite literally decades. And one of the things that leapt out at me, but here's something that took me by surprise. This is Stephen talking. How quickly and decisively the visionaries I chronicled aligned themselves with Trump, a man whose values violently clashed with the egalitarian impulses of the digital revolution. When you think of the first time that I had read Stephen Levy's works decades ago, and he chronicled kind of the beginning of modern day Silicon Valley, the type of entrepreneurs that he profiled then were really almost like counterculture hippies. I mean, they had a rebellious streak in them. And I mean, I'm thinking of the Apple ad, the 1984 ad, is let's take on Big Brother. And here we are now coming to a totally different arc where, frankly, the biggest Silicon Valley executives are Big Brother.
That's exactly right. And, Stephen was, in every possible way, the perfect person to write that piece. He started chronicling the tech industry in the 1980s. He has written several books about several of these companies. He has met people like Mark Zuckerberg, Sergey Brin, Larry Page, Steve Jobs at the earliest moments of their careers, and then watched them and followed them in the decades that passed. And so for him to make that observation, I think is particularly poignant and I think particularly resonant. But you're exactly right. The people that he was chronicling in the 90s and the early 2000s, they were rebels, and they did see technology and later, social media and sort of the advent of social platforms as a force for good, as a democratizing force, as a force that would bring us all closer together, that would create, a more egalitarian society. That was this sort of rebel Silicon Valley movement fighting the status quo. The reality is those same individuals running these companies have become so wealthy, and these companies have become so well-funded and so powerful that they are now very much the status quo. They are the man. They are, if anything, as powerful as, the United States government, certainly as governments around the world. That is how much clout they have. And we are now seeing what they're doing with it. And instead of sort of keeping that rebel spirit alive and well, they are at all costs protecting their business interests and their desire to essentially consolidate power. And that's exactly why they are working so closely and so hand in hand with the administration.
There's a a quote in there that he has from a very prominent technologist and now investor named Mark Andreessen, who people don't know. He built this thing called the Netscape browser, which was now it's ancient history, but it really was integral into how we perceived the internet and the web at that time, right? And he has become an incredibly powerful person, and he talks about this kind of this deal that seemed to be, underlying what was the Silicon Valley ethos of how they could work with government. What went wrong with that deal, especially through the Biden administration?
Well, as far as Mark Andreessen seems to be concerned, the deal was essentially the technology industry is able to operate, they're able to innovate, to do business, effectively and with sort of maybe minimal intervention, or at least with, sort of federal support and buy-in. And in exchange, they would champion sort of social values of the left, ostensibly, right? That is the deal as he saw it. And as he and other executives in the Valley see it, the Biden administration took a very heavy, very damaging hand vis-a-vis the technology industry, whether it was trying to break up monopolies, whether it was trying to sort of police the conduct of social media companies, or sort of, behavior on the internet to hold platforms accountable. They felt that the Biden administration made it very difficult for their businesses to grow and to flourish and to innovate. And they really took exception to that. I mean, in many instances, they found it personally offensive, personally hurtful. This was not just about business being tough. This was about them feeling like their feelings had been hurt, and like some, again, unspoken deal had been violated on the part of the Biden administration. And that is what, in many cases, seems to have pushed many of these executives to openly embrace the Trump administration, because they saw an opportunity to work with an administration and with regulators who would take a more lax approach. And so they have certainly taken every opportunity to ensure that the Trump administration is aligned with their agenda, whether it's, how social media companies should or should not be policed, how artificial intelligence should or should not be regulated. They see an opportunity in Trump to get what they want. And so they are happy to throw that deal out the window, because they think that the Biden administration already did. They're happy to throw that deal out the window and just go all in.
How successful, or I guess for them, how successful has it been? Or just to, from the perspective of Wired that's chronicled so many of these things, how different is that regulatory environment now versus, say, a year ago?
Well, I think in many respects, it has been incredibly successful. I mean, I think two key examples, and again, we're only sort of 8 months into this. We've got more than 3 years to go to see how this plays out. But I think two really good examples are cryptocurrency and artificial intelligence. So obviously the Trump administration has embraced crypto. They have opened the door for crypto companies to grow relatively unfettered and to become much more mainstream and much more sort of established than they were even a year ago, when they still sort of skirted very much beneath the radar, below the radar. The Trump administration has made it much easier for crypto companies to operate in this country. And then with artificial intelligence, I think what is so interesting to me and so interesting to us at Wired is in 2023 and 2024, when generative AI was really sort of reaching mainstream prominence, it sort of blew up in the mainstream consciousness. You had technology executives like Sam Altman very publicly on the record say, we want regulation. This industry needs to be regulated. Bring it on. We want to work with the government to make this happen. Fast forward to the Trump administration unveiling their AI action plan over the summer, which essentially says, go for it, guys. We're going to take a very light hand in regulating you because we need to beat China. So let's go. And instead of those tech executives saying, hold on a second, what happened to all the regulation that we were asking for? They said, we are thrilled to work in such a pro-innovation environment. We are thrilled to partner with the Trump administration on building out this industry in the United States of America. So really sort of that drastic about face in AI regulation is probably one of the most consequential examples and one of the most visible so far.
One of the quotes that Stephen Levy lays out is really just about the consolidation of power, too. It says, an extraordinarily tiny number of billionaires who control the information ecosystem have made allyship with the most consequential and fearsome political power in the world. There's never been a time in history when those things have been combined. I mean, when you had a separate piece in the in the magazine about Elon Musk and his control of really an entire sector, which is space, and how much power he has over, say, for example, the satellites that are floating around right now over war zones, establishing reliable communications for, frankly, both sides of the war in Ukraine and Russia.
Absolutely. I mean, Elon Musk is a terrific example of this. And I think there's no question that Elon Musk is working very diligently to repair his relationship with the president and with the administration, precisely because he has very lucrative government contracts that he needs to maintain in order to essentially build, a space empire that now sort of far outstrips NASA and NASA's abilities to do what Elon Musk is doing at their behest and with their funding. So I think that's one great example. I think another example that feels really relevant in this very moment is actually what's happening with Larry Ellison, right? So this is a tech billionaire who skirted beneath the surface for a very long time. He was not someone that we at Wired paid that much attention to until maybe 6 months ago, when we saw him standing with Sam Altman and President Trump to announce this massive infrastructure investment in AI technology, Stargate. What we are now seeing with Larry Ellison and the Ellison family is potentially a really unprecedented consolidation of control over media, over culture, over our data, right? When you look at Paramount and CBS, you look at the possibility of Warner Brothers Discovery, which encompasses CNN. And then, of course, now we're talking about this TikTok deal, which would put the data of 170 million American users in the hands of Larry Ellison and the Ellison family and Oracle, the company that he controls. So that is a startling amount of consolidation of sort of what we consume, how we consume it, the news and information that we obtain, and the filters through which we obtain it, right? This TikTok algorithm that we know now will be retrained. We don't know how it will be retrained, but we know the people in charge of that retraining are very closely aligned with the president.
Are there longer-term costs for the lack of a regulatory environment right now on AI? And I'm thinking back to how during the Obama administration, the social networks were essentially allowed a free hand. And I wonder, what are we going to look at 10 years out and say, we didn't put these particular types of guardrails on AI?
The fact that we are not looking at social media as a cautionary tale that cannot be repeated is deeply, deeply unfortunate. And to your point, incredibly consequential. I think one of the most salient examples here is exactly that. It's children, right? Social media has had an extremely detrimental effect on a generation of children and teenagers. And we are now seeing that exact same phenomenon play out with artificial intelligence and how it is impacting children's ability to learn, to socialize, to engage in romantic relationships, to safeguard their mental health. And there is conversation about that. There is media coverage. There are alarm bells being sounded, but will there be regulation in time to protect this next generation of children? I think the potential damage that we are doing on an environmental level with the data centers, with the infrastructure that's being built, with sort of the massive, massive amounts of energy that are required to fuel this artificial intelligence boom. I mean, the fact that that is happening with little to no oversight or regulation or desire to sort of put standards in place for how these companies ought to operate. What does efficiency look like in the context of AI? What does it need to look like? The fact that that is not a conversation that is happening on a daily basis right now should be incredibly concerning, especially when you're talking about an administration that already doesn't seem particularly inclined to accept climate change as a fact, which it is.
Just recently, we had news that affected the tech industry, which was the H-1B visa program having an additional $100,000 fee put onto it for all the highly skilled workers. And I wonder, what's the ripple effect going to be on tech? And I see that kind of breaking in my own head differently for Amazon, which is the largest employer of H-1Bs, that might have the money to pay the $100,000 versus a smaller company that might be using some of this highly skilled labor and just can't afford to tack on an extra $100,000 on whatever the salary would be.
Yeah, and look, it seems like that's exactly the point. I think, first of all, it's important to know that not only is Amazon the topmost sponsor of H-1B visas, but right after Amazon come essentially every other big tech company in this country. I mean, H-1B visas are vital to this industry, and they have been for a very long time. Now, yes, could these companies pay that fee? Absolutely. Will they have to? That's less clear. What we know about this president and what we have seen from him many, many times is that he's happy to do a deal if he gets something out of it. So it will be interesting to see sort of what kinds of deals are brokered that perhaps create exemptions for certain companies. Now, it's also quite easy to extrapolate from all of this, or sort of hypothesize that the companies that will not get those kinds of exemptions, the companies that, regardless of what Trump decides to do, will be vulnerable to those fees, are the startups. They're the disruptors. They are, in some ways, we hope, right, the new rebels, the new renegades of the industry who are building something new, something fresh, something exciting. All of that has the potential to be stomped out. And what we will then see is greater and greater consolidation of power, of clout, of might among this big tech cohort who are aligning themselves with the president. So the prospect of sort of stifling innovation and stifling these smaller companies is exactly the risk that we're looking at. And that benefits big tech. And of course, the administration seems ambivalent about that.
Is this an ideological shift in Silicon Valley, or is it transactional? And I mean, if it's transactional, because some of the tech leaders have kind of said things and done things, and you're just like, well, if there's somebody, a new sheriff in town, so to speak, in 4 years, are you going to walk some of this back?
When I think about sort of this cadre of tech executive, and whether we are looking at something ideological or we are looking at something purely transactional, I really do think it depends on the executive, right? So they are not sort of a monolith. Ultimately, though, when I take them all in aggregate, what we are looking at is strategic behavior. I mean, this is all about business transaction and opportunity and opportunism. But I think that in and of itself represents its own ideology, right? I mean, it is the ideology of sort of pure, unfettered capitalistic gain. That is ultimately, I think now, sadly, maybe the ideology of Silicon Valley. It is profit at all cost, even if that means presenting President Trump with a custom-made statue in the Oval Office. That's part of the deal. And that is ultimately what Silicon Valley is now.
The special issue of Wired is called All Hail the Technocracy. Global editorial director Katie Drummond, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Next to the use of executive power, the presidential pardon has long been a clause in the Constitution. But with 11 elected American officials receiving clemency from Trump this year, is it being misused? Professor Sai Prakash speaks to Walter Isaacson about this, detailed in his new book.
Thank you, Biana and Professor Sai Prakash. Welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be with you here today.
You've got your new book. It's called The Presidential Pardon, the short clause with a long, troubled history. Let's begin with the history. How did it begin?
Well, as you know, Walter, this pardon power, exists in many different civilizations, but our pardon power mostly comes from the Brits. As colonies, we benefited from the pardon power, and then when they created when they declared independence, the states exercised some bit of pardon power, as did the Continental Congress. When they got to the Philadelphia Convention, they decided that there needed to be a pardon power at the federal level, in part because many criminal laws were too harsh, and they saw a need to reduce that harshness through the pardon power. And so that's why we have a pardon power in the federal Constitution.
I think Alexander Hamilton defends it in the Federalist Papers and even gets into a bit of an argument with George Mason down in Virginia, where they have it different on impeachment. Explain those arguments.
So Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist is defending the Constitution. It actually turns out that at the convention, he did not want to have the president have the power to pardon treason. But when he's talking about the Constitution, as Publius, his job is to defend the Constitution as it is. And his discussion in the Federalist is somewhat nuanced, because he doesn't say that there aren't any potential issues with the breadth of the pardon power. He admits that there are, but he says on balance, it's better to give the president an unfettered power, because if you fetter it, you're making it more difficult to give pardons, especially in cases of rebellion. He talks about that at great length. So he sees the wisdom of giving the president a broad pardon power, but we don't really know what he thinks, because what we're seeing is a bit of advocacy on his part. The game is to try to get the Constitution ratified, and of course he and others are successful.
So you talk about rebellion and that they needed it in cases of rebellion to try to bring the country together. And so George Washington does that with the Whiskey Rebellion, a pretty wild, treasonous thing, 2 people convicted for death. And then Alexander Hamilton is kind of shocked that he does that, right?
Well, as you're right that there's people in Western Pennsylvania that don't want to pay a tax on whiskey, and they tar and feather collectors, and they obstruct the U.S. Marshal from enforcing the law by ordinary means. And Washington sends state militias, and one of the tools he uses is lay down your arms, become peaceable again, and you'll get a pardon. And so that's the first sort of mass pardon under the Constitution. And you're right that some Federalists are dismayed because they want a crackdown to prevent rebellions going forward. And, it turns out that there is another rebellion in Pennsylvania several years later under the Adams administration. Was it a result of the mercy shown by Washington? It's hard to say. We've had a number of rebellions. We had the Civil War, and there was no rebellion after that. But certainly, Hamilton and I guess Washington proved that a well-timed offer of pardon could lead to a pacification of the populace, because sometimes people start a rebellion and then they come to their senses, or they decide it's not such a good idea, and a pardon makes them, gives them confidence that if they lay down their arms, they're not going to be executed for having taken them up in the first instance.
Well, of course, that has echoes today with the January 6th insurrection and Trump giving a pardon all the way through. How is that different?
Well, I think what's going on today, Walter, is that the pardon power is being used for political purposes in ways that, would have been unfathomable at the founding. The book talks about how many different pardons by many different presidents were perceived as partisan or political, meaning they were perceived as advancing the interests of the incumbent. And that's happened repeatedly, but the kinds of pardons we're seeing now, both to prevent prosecutions but also to undo prosecutions, I think is fairly unprecedented, right? On January 19th, you have President Biden pardoning a bunch of folks who he thought might be prosecuted by President Trump, and then President Trump comes into office and undoes, prosecutions related to January 6th. And then on top of that, we have the prospect of candidates for the president promising pardons as a means of getting elected, which we haven't seen before. I think the first time we saw it was Joe Biden and marijuana. And of course, Trump explicitly campaigned on a promise of pardons to folks related to January 6th. And I think we're going to see this going forward, where presidents or candidates run for office saying, I will pardon some group, and thereby hope to gather votes from people who are sympathetic to that group.
You write that the pardon power can effectively rewrite some of Congress's laws, whatever Congress wants. Tell me how that works.
Well, so, Walter, the president not only can give an absolute pardon, a full and unconditional pardon, the president can also commute sentences. And so if a president believes that the penalty for, failing to file your taxes is too high, the president can reduce the financial penalty, or the president can reduce the sentence, right? The Congress might provide that failing to file your tax returns is a 10-year crime, and the president can say, I think it's a 6-month crime. And the Congress can provide that, dumping pollutants is a $10 million fine, and the president can say, I think it's a $1,000 fine. And that's what I mean by sort of effectively rewriting the statutes, right? Any maximum that Congress, or any minimum rather, that Congress puts in a statute, the president can undo through a commutation. And of course, if the president really dislikes the statute, he could, theoretically at least, try to pardon all violations of it and thereby effectively undermine the statute, right? And so that's arguably what President Biden did with respect to marijuana. And again, one might favor the decriminalization of marijuana, but still understand that what Biden did with respect to marijuana could be done with respect to any statute, that has a penalty attached to it.
One of the controversial pardons was when President Clinton pardoned the billionaire, convicted financier Mark Rich. Is this part of sort of a downward spiral or just ratcheting badly of the abuses of the pardon power?
I very much think so, Walter. Mark Rich was pardoned by Clinton on the last day of his presidential term, and there was a firestorm that resulted in congressional investigations and a U.S. attorney investigation. And there was a bipartisan sense that this was wrong, that people should not get pardons if they contribute to the president's library, or if their spouses or ex-spouses contribute to the president's library or campaign. This was such a powerful sense that when George W. Bush tried to pardon Isaac Toucey, they kind of revoked the pardon after the fact. But now I think we've kind of, gone off the deep end. President Trump is pardoning many, many contributors. And there are some voices criticizing that, but I think they're rather muted. And I think they haven't really affected the president's incentives. I've seen the president showing no hesitation to pardon those who have contributed to his campaign or his super PAC. And I wonder whether that taboo has been utterly broken by this president, meaning to say the next president might be willing to pardon contributors on the sense that, well, why shouldn't contributors also be able to get a pardon? Why should they be disabled from getting the pardon? They should be able to get a pardon like anybody else. And then you might suspect that people who contribute are more likely to get a pardon because they're more likely to get the president's attention.
Tell me about the Trump pardons to contributors and others. Which ones bother you the most?
Well, I think they're all kind of troubling. What I would say is that there are lots of, what's going on now, Walter, is people are facing millions and hundreds of millions of dollars of fines, and they're getting a pardon which not only absolves them of guilt, but also erases those fines, which has a rather huge effect on the Treasury. And if you're someone who's a billionaire or a multi-millionaire, you can see why you would pay, why you would donate to a campaign or pay a lobbyist several $1 million, thinking that you might avoid a $100 million or a $200 million or even a $500 million fine. It makes economic sense, right, from a purely cost-benefit analysis to spend that money to donate to the president's super PAC or to hire an expensive lobbyist because you're avoiding such a huge fine. And so I think we're going to see more people donating to the president's super PAC or doing business with the president or donating to a presidential campaign in the hopes of getting a pardon because, again, that taboo is broken. And from their point of view, if they can avoid 2 or 3 years of jail time and or hundreds of $millions of fines with $20 or $30 million, that's a very good investment.
One of the things that President Biden did, former President Biden, besides giving a pardon to his son who had been charged with a crime, he pardoned people preemptively, such as General Milley or Dr. Anthony Fauci, who had not been charged with anything. Members of the House committee hadn't been charged. Was that a new move on the pardon?
No, that's always been a possibility. Go back to the rebellion example. When you pardon rebels, you're not saying we're going to prosecute you, convict you, and then give you a pardon. You're saying if you lay down your arms now, you won't be prosecuted. Here is a pardon, right? So you're often going to make a pardon before any prosecution in order to, avoid that prosecution. And I think President Biden thought these people were innocent, that they were likely to be targeted by President Trump. And so he pardoned them preemptively. And whether one thinks that's a good idea or not turns on whether one thinks these folks committed crimes that ought to be prosecuted. Obviously, President Trump and his allies did think that. But when President Trump leaves office, I suspect he's going to do something similar to his allies. He's going to pardon them to prevent a Democratic administration from prosecuting them. And then a different set of people will feel rather aggrieved by that because they will feel like the president is pardoning his allies, some of whom committed crimes, and it's wrong to give them this blanket immunity upon leaving office because it sort of incentivizes them to do wrongful things while they're in office. I mean, in other words, if President Trump's appointees know they're going to be pardoned at the end of his term, they might do all manner of things that they ought not to do and that they wouldn't do but for this idea of a preemptive pardon at the end of his term.
Could a president give a preemptive pardon to himself for the rest of his life?
Well, it's a great question. We've never had a president pardon himself. There was a governor, a territorial governor, who pardoned himself out in the western United States, but the president's never done it. Nixon was told that he couldn't do it, and so he didn't do it. I think if a president ever pardoned himself, I think it would suggest to the public that he had done something wrong, because otherwise, why are you pardoning yourself? There's always a sense, rightly or wrongly, that people that are pardoned have done something wrong, even if they haven't necessarily done something wrong. But that's the sort of working assumption people have. And so I don't know if one of the last acts of a president should be or ought to be a president trying to pardon himself. The only way we would know whether that was constitutional or not is if a subsequent administration tried to prosecute the president. If they have no interest in prosecuting the president, then the pardon really had no effect on the president's immunity from prosecution, right? So a self-pardon, whether it will have real effect, will turn on whether someone is willing to prosecute an ex-president. We've seen that for the first time with respect to Trump. I hope we don't see too much of that going forward. But of course, I suppose part of that turns on what we think our presidents are doing while in office.
You talk about President Trump's pardon of the January 6th insurrectionists, and you say it's going to reverberate in extraordinary, unprecedented, and unforeseen ways. Tell me about that.
Well, I think part of what's going. So the first thing we need to remember is that President Trump ran on giving them a pardon. Now, when he ran for president, the third time, he said he wasn't going to pardon everybody, because he said some of those people were violent offenders, and so he suggested he was only going to give a pardon to some. And then when he got into office, I think he decided he didn't want to distinguish the violent offenders from the folks who just wandered into the Capitol. And I think he just wanted to fulfill this promise as soon as possible. And he kind of realized that he would face continuing pressure to pardon them, even if he didn't pardon them at the outset. So he just sort of decided to, cut the Gordian knot, so to speak, and pardon them all. But I think what you might suspect is that going forward, presidents are going to run for office promising to pardon their allies, their political allies, their partisan allies, and hoping to secure their votes, hoping to secure their enthusiasm for their candidacy. And, it turns out that sometimes partisans are guilty of crimes, right? It's not as if every partisan is spotless and, innocent of crimes. And so I don't think we should be using the pardon power to reward our political allies and to secure votes, right? Which is kind of what's going on in the past two administrations. So but I do think this is what is going to this is what's going to happen going forward, right? Because unlike many of the promises the president makes, a candidate makes when running for president, this is a promise that the president can actually fulfill, right? The president does not need to go to Congress to pardon people. And there's no judicial review, or very little judicial review, of these pardons, right? Meaning that the president has unfettered discretion to satisfy or to meet his campaign promises, which makes it a very attractive promise to make, and it makes it a very attractive promise to fulfill.
Short of a constitutional amendment rewriting this famous clause, is there anything that can be done? Any guardrails that can be put in?
I think the American people can vote for candidates who promise to be more circumspect in granting pardons, who promise to follow a practice of listening to people who have reviewed these applications in great detail. Right now, and at the end of every administration for the last several administrations, presidents are acting at the behest of lobbyists to a greater degree than they're acting at the request of experts who have reviewed these applications. And so if presidents would sort of revert to some sort of more normal process of having experts review these applications and then pledging to act upon only those applications that experts have vetted, then I think people would have greater confidence in the pardon process, if they perceive that pardons are being promised to get votes, and if they perceive that pardons are being given to contributors, then I could see very little reason why you should feel very confident about this process, because it seems to favor the rich and the wealthy and the connected more than the average person who might have committed a crime in the past but has led an exemplary life in prison or out of prison and therefore might merit a pardon.
Professor Sai Prakash, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been my honor and pleasure. Thank you.
When it comes to American history, it is the Holy Grail, the American Revolution, of course, but there is still much to be learned. That is certainly what our next guest thinks, and he should know. Ken Burns has been chronicling American history and culture for decades. He first rose to prominence 35 years ago with his PBS series on the Civil War, and now he's turning his lens to that much-vaunted American origin story, the American Revolution, with a new 12-hour documentary for PBS.
From a small spark kindled in America, a flame has arisen, not to be extinguished.
We think about independence movements of the 20th century. You don't always recognize the fact that the United States actually started that.
The American Revolutionary Movement served as a model for freedom from oppression.
America is predicated on an idea that tells us who we are, where we came from, and what our forebears were willing to die for.
Collins said no taxation without representation. The fear was, if we give in to this precedent, what will they do in the future?
Crisis changes people. It gave different people different ideas about what they should be doing.
It gave them a space to make this democracy real.
And he joins Walter Isaacson to talk about it.
Thank you, Christian. And Ken Burns, welcome back to the show.
Great to be with you, Walter.
You have this multi-part series, The American Revolution, that's coming out. And you say that the American Revolution is the most important event since the birth of Christ. Whoa. Tell me why you think it was that important.
I wasn't trying to be provocative. I was just beginning to realize that there's a moment a little bit after the phrase pursuit of happiness, the great second sentence of the Declaration, where Jefferson says, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. It's not hard to parse. It just means that heretofore, everybody's been a subject to an authoritarian rule. And now we're creating this new thing called citizens. The Old Testament says there's nothing new under the sun. That's Ecclesiastes. So there's actually for a moment something new under the sun, and I want to rivet people's attention.
Do you think they felt it was that big of a deal?
Yes.
Or did they think it was a rebellion against taxes or something?
Well, it starts off that way. It gathers momentum like a snowball going down the hill. You know, at first it's Parliament and it's British complaints about British law, and then all of a sudden it gets broken out because it's the Enlightenment, you know, into universal truths, and then all of a sudden they're saying things like all men are created equal. Now, I know that Jefferson meant all white men of property free of debt, but the word all, as the scholar Yuval Levin says, you know, that's just like the walls of Jericho is just broken down. It's a trumpet that is going to just wear away. And even though it's 69 years before slavery ends, and it's an unforgivable 144 years before women get the right to vote, this is a big deal. So it's constantly enlarging. And if you think about it, the whole project is about that. It's pursuit of happiness. It's a more perfect union. We're sort of a nation in the process of becoming, and this is our big bang of which we know nothing about. And we're in an expanding universe, even when we can fret and chicken little a particular moment and say we're so divided. We'll go back to our revolution. We're as divided as ever. It's a revolution, and it's a bloody one. It's also a civil war in a way that our own civil war is a sectional war, and it's also a global war, and it is the fourth global war over the prize of North America. So you've got all of these free electrons sort of banging around this thing. And they're people, though, They know how important it is. They're talking about us. They're talking about you and me, Walter. They're saying millions yet unborn. They have a sense of a responsibility, not just to themselves and their families and this crazy, impossible, never going to happen idea that has zero chance of success at Lexington Green on April 1975.
We are in the very midst of a revolution. The most complete, unexpected, and remarkable of any in the history of nations. Objects of the most stupendous magnitude, and measures in which the lives and liberties of millions yet unborn are intimately interested, are now before us. John Adams.
And it's just a spectacular thing. And it's not just the top-down guys. It's not just the bold-faced names who have sort of been so encrusted with the barnacles of sentimentality. Our job is to sort of make them a little bit more human and dimensional and people that you can relate to. But the better thing is to introduce you to literally scores and scores of other people I'd never heard about who are central to this story as well.
You talk about the barnacles of sentimentality that have encrusted, and we all think of the grand statesmen who go into Independence Hall, but your whole show, as you just said, is about the ordinary people, the ones where the bullet goes thud and it hits their chest.
It hits them.
Or the slave, or the woman homespinning. How did you decide to tell it through so many people as opposed to the grand leaders of the revolution?
Well, they're not mutually exclusive, and that's the problem with our binary sensibilities today. We're so dialectically preoccupied, you think you have to then throw everybody out. George Washington had slaves, so he's got to go, well, we don't have a country without George Washington. So you're going to just have to get over that there's this stuff and there's this stuff, and the scales of justice and his creator has dealt with him in this. But we need to tell all the stories and tell a complicated and dimensional story. So when I say the prize of North America, what am I talking about? I'm talking about land. Well, who occupies that land? Hundreds of different peoples, not them, but hundreds of peoples who've been on the world scene, in at least those on the eastern seaboard and the Ohio Valley. They've been on the world scene in trade and in diplomacy for centuries. They know Britain, they know Spain, they know France, they know the Dutch. It is each one of them has a different set, and it's their confederacies, their union among the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, that inspires Franklin 20 years before the Revolution to say, hey, we could do this. We could have a union just like them. And
wait, explain that a bit more, because it's key to what you they have a federated of the Six Nations, and it's a federal system. And Ben Franklin says, okay, the Albany plan, we'll make that our system.
So he draws a picture of a cut up snake with most of the states. And underneath it is this dire warning, join or die. And he convenes 7 of the 13 colonies at Albany in 1754, and they adopt his plan of union based on the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Tuscarora, Oneida, and Mohawk of the Iroquois Confederacy. And then they go home to try to sell it, and nobody wants to give up their autonomy. Not a single colony wants to give up their autonomy. So the plan dies, but 20 years later, join or die is a war cry in the most consequential revolution in history. So you've got to center, whatever the common word is, a Native American experience. Half the population are women. Out of the 3 million people, 500,000 are enslaved or free Black Americans. You've got Spanish to the south. You've got French licking their wounds. You have British hiring German soldiers. You have backcountry people. You have educated, sort of the elites, we'd call them today, who are trying to sort of figure out, well, maybe we are going to split and we're going to start a republic. The dynamism is so intense that you just can't ignore it. Let me just take one kid, 15 years old, signs up a few days after the Declaration in July of 1776, Joseph Plum Martin from Connecticut. He's the archetypal grunt you've met in every film about the Civil War, about World War II, about Vietnam, complaining about the food, complaining about the weather, complaining about the orders, and he's there from the beginning.
By the way, you got his letters.
We got his letters.
Those type of things that form this film.
Every private soldier in an army thinks his particular service is as essential to carry on the war he's engaged in as the services of the most influential general. And why not? What could officers do without such men? Nothing at all. Great men get great praise. Little men, nothing.
Joseph Plum Martin comes in. He's blooded in the Battle of Long Island, which is the biggest battle and a total disaster for the Patriots. But he's there at Redoubt number 10 at Yorktown, that's being led by Lafayette and by Alexander Hamilton. But he's leading the charge into this redoubt with the abattis, the spiked French, the logs of the British positions. And he says, the man at my left was hit with a bullet and falls crying bitterly, but there was no stopping us. And there's a great famous painting of the attack over Redoubt number 10, but it is so powerful that there's Joseph Plum Martin, who's right behind him, free black soldiers from Rhode Island who've been promised their freedom once the war is over. And even Connecticut and Rhode Island are talking about compensating their owners for the property that they've lost as a result of this one charge. You've got a Frenchman, our pal. You've got Alexander Hamilton, who has played a huge role and will continue to play a huge role in the history of the United States. And this is what we tried to capture and bottle. We followed reenactors for 6 years, filming them not to reenact this battle, but to collect a critical mass of imagery to offset the fact that clearly, obviously, there's no photographs and no newsreels, but that doesn't mean those people are different than us. Photographs sort of prove a similarity, and we see the paintings and the buckles and the hose and the breeches and the waistcoats and the powdered wigs and think they can't be like us. They're exactly like us.
Well, as you say, it's a tapestry filled with all sorts of people, large and small, but the hero line throughout is George Washington, the person you've mentioned who's done it all. But you do have to wrestle with the fact that he not only is an enslaver, but a pretty cruel one at that. He also loses a lot of battles and lots of blunders, and he was ruthless to the Native Americans. I think you quote Jane Kamensky in episode 2, "Do not look for the gilded statues of marble men."
That's right.
That's the theme of what you've done, is make these people flesh, not marble. But explain how hard that was with Washington.
Well, first of all, Washington is so endlessly interesting. But there's no opacity to him. But as you say, if you can take him all in all, then he's dimensional in his failures. He's also incredibly modest. And so the letters that he writes, and so I got the actor Josh Brolin to play him. And I said, Josh, this man is unknowable. Can you help me understand a little bit about him? Let that leak in a little bit.
The unparalleled perseverance of the armies of the United States through almost every possible suffering and discouragement for the space of 8 long years was little short of a standing miracle. George Washington.
Let's just put it this way. Without Washington's leadership, we don't have a country. And that's the key to this, is that what we do, particularly in a media culture or a computer culture where everything's a 1 or a 0, a yes or a no, a red state or a blue state, is we think it's just divided that way. But everybody has complication and undertow. But, you've got to be able to understand people in their totality and to celebrate that contradiction. And this reminds us of our own lives, the own paradoxes within ourselves and the paradoxes we feel to the people that are closest to us, that we love the most, who remain in some ways inscrutable to us. So good history is, of course, thinking it might not turn out the way you know it did.
So many of your documentaries deal with race. Whether it's jazz, whether it's baseball, whether it's civil rights. This one deals with race, too. Explain how you felt race was so critical here.
Well, look, it's there in all my other films, because the guy who wrote our catechism, the second sentence of the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident. You and I know the story of the word self-evident. More complicated than that all men are created equal. Let's stop there. owned hundreds of human beings and didn't see the contradiction, didn't see the hypocrisy, and didn't see fit in his lifetime to free any of those slaves, and set in motion an American narrative, not responsible entirely to Jefferson, but symbolically attached to Jefferson, because he gave words to our aspirations, our noblest aspirations. So this is going to play out all through the decades, but no more so in this moment when the people, particularly Southern planters and enslavers of a great number of people, are describing what they think George III is doing to them as enslaving them. And the liberty talk, as Jane Kaminsky says in our film, is leaky. The people that are serving them are hearing it, and they want it too. Native Americans want it. Women want it too. And
well, you give voice to a lot of enslaved and former slaves. And one of the things that struck me is how they had to choose sides in this revolution. And I think, 15,000 or so end up on the British side, and less than that, 5,000 end up on the Patriot side. Tell me about having to make that choice.
So the entire British Empire's profit depends on the 13 colonies in the Caribbean that are hugely profitable because it's the work of enslaved people. And our 13 are the least profitable, and only Virginia and the Carolinas, for the obvious reason, have some profitability for the British Empire. But cynically, Lord Dunmore, who owns other human beings himself, says, well, if you're an enslaved person of a rebel, please come and get your freedom from me. If you're the enslaved person of a loyalist, by the way, stay where you are. You're enslaved for the rest of your life, right? So you're seeing black families making decisions about what to do, running for daylight. And as it turns out, many of them make a decision to fight with the British, or at least align themselves with the British. 5,000 make a decision to fight. We think 20,000 are engaged, 15 fight for the British. Native Americans are making the same kind of choice, but also all other Americans are too. This is a bloody civil war. There are people who are loyalists and saying, all of my good fortune, all of my literacy, my health, the fact that I own land when my family for 1,000 years was working dependent land in Wales and Scotland and Ireland and England, never had this chance. I have it here. Why am I going to risk it for this crazy, untested idea when the British constitutional monarchy looks to be the finest form of government on earth, at least in the Western sense of that? They're not wrong. And so we don't make loyalists bad people. We make them understandable. We have Roger Lamb, an Irish soldier, watching in a lull in the fighting at the Battle of Saratoga. One British soldier, they're trading insults or jokes or whatever. They're happy to have a lull, as all soldiers are. And one just gets up and runs down, jumps in the water and swims midstream. Meanwhile, an American gets down and jumps, and they're two brothers. They embrace midstream. They didn't know they hadn't talked to each other, seen each other for years, and they were on the other side trying to kill each other in the Battle of Saratoga.
Let me read you some of the charges from the end of the Declaration of Independence against the king. And they kind of resonate today in what we would think. One of it is for obstructing laws for naturalization, refusing to encourage immigration here, made judges dependent on his will, kept among us standing armies in times of peace, quartering bodies of armed troops among us, cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, and he's excited domestic insurrections against us. Every one of those, you might notice, could be echoed today.
Our friend Mark Twain is supposed to have said that history doesn't repeat itself, which of course it doesn't. No event has happened twice. But Twain said it rhymes. And anybody who spent any time talking about the past suddenly realizes in every instance, my first film that was on PBS, back in the early 80s on the Brooklyn Bridge, rhymed with things that were going on. This rhymes in spectacular ways. Our job is to tell what happened and to know that it will rhyme, but also to be aware of the fact that you date your film if you say, isn't this so much like this moment? Because what you want with good history is to have it be durable. So anything that that puts my thumb on the scale and says, oh, isn't this like today, is a distraction. It is always going to be like today. and tomorrow as it was yesterday. And we benefit from what's happened over the last 50 years in this increase of knowledge since the bicentennial to the semi-quincentennial that gives us a chance to have a complicated American conversation with, I hope, little shouting.
Ken Burns, as always, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Walter.